In the heart of Montana's vast prairies, a ruthless rancher issued a challenge that stunned the entire valley. If a poor stable hand could tame the fiercest horse anyone had ever seen, he would win the hand of his daughter. But behind the dust and danger, this was more than a wager. It was the beginning of a battle between pride, love, and the scars of the past. The wind of Montana carried the scent of sagebrush and wild grass across the endless plains, whispering through the cracks of a weather-beaten wooden cabin that had stood for decades against storms and silence. Inside, Ethan Miller stirred before dawn, the floorboards groaning under his weight as he rose from his thin mattress. His hands were calloused from long days of labor, his shirt worn at the elbows, but his spirit was not yet broken. He glanced at his mother, Mary, asleep in the small bed near the hearth, her breathing shallow and uneven. A faint rattle in her chest reminded him why he worked harder than most men twice his age. Ethan lit the stove with practiced hands and placed a dented kettle of water to boil. As he did, he thought of the small stash of coins hidden in a jar above the mantel, barely enough for a few days of medicine, not nearly enough for the months of treatment she needed. He swallowed hard and pressed the lid back down, as if keeping the truth sealed inside. The prairie dawn was already painting the horizon pink and gold when he strapped on his worn boots and stepped outside. His eyes scanned the open land, where wild horses roamed in the distance, their silhouettes sharp against the rising Sunday. To Ethan, they were symbols of freedom, of strength he longed for but rarely felt. The Miller cabin sat on the edge of Carter Valley, named for Jacob Carter, the wealthiest rancher in miles. His land stretched as far as the eye could see, rivers and meadows fenced by cedar posts, cattle grazing under the watch of hired ranch hands. To families like the Millers, Carter was more than a man. He was a force that decided who thrived and who withered. Ethan had worked off and on at the Carter Ranch since he was 14, doing whatever was needed, mending fences, hauling feed, or cleaning the stables. He had learned to keep his head down, to move quickly, and to avoid the sharp gaze of Jacob Carter himself. That morning, Ethan walked the dusty trail into town, with his satchel slung across his shoulder, hoping for day work at the stockyards. The path wound through stretches of wildflowers and patches of pine, but Ethan's eyes were distant. He thought of his father, who had died in a ranching accident years ago, leaving behind only debts and the memory of a strong, laughing man who had taught him how to ride before he could read. Since then, Ethan had carried the weight of the family alone, his only comfort the rhythm of hoofbeats when he worked near horses. In town, men in wide-brimmed hats leaned against railings, smoking and laughing as wagons rattled by. The smell of leather, manure, and brewing coffee filled the air. Ethan kept to himself, asking quietly if anyone needed a hand. Some ranchers waved him off, but at the feed store, a foreman pointed him toward a pen where 2 restless steers needed loading. Ethan nodded and set to work. He moved with patience, whistling low to calm the animals, guiding them with gentle but firm gestures. It wasn't long before the job was done, sweat dampening his collar, coins clinking lightly in his palm. "Not bad, kid," one of the older ranch hands muttered, giving him a curt nod. Praise was rare in this place, and Ethan tucked the words away like treasure. On his way back through town, Ethan stopped at the small chapel where his mother sometimes prayed when she was strong enough to travel. He sat on the steps, staring at the wooden cross, wondering if anyone up there still listened to boys like him. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter, a girl's laughter, clear and light, carried across the street. He turned his head and saw her, Abigail Carter. She wore a simple dress of pale blue, her dark hair braided neatly, though a few strands had escaped and danced in the wind. She was with a chaperone, an older woman dressed in black, who frowned as Abigail tugged against her guiding arm. Abigail's eyes were bright, scanning the market stalls with a curiosity that seemed endless. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. He had seen her from afar once before at a church service, but never this close. She seemed like she belonged to another world, a world of polished boots and polished manners, not dust and patched clothing. As fate would have it, their eyes met. Just for a heartbeat, long enough for Ethan to feel a rush of heat in his chest, Abigail's smile faltered into something softer, curious, before the older woman pulled her away with a firm hand. That night, back at the cabin, Ethan didn't tell his mother about the girl. Instead, he mended a broken strap on an old saddle, his mind drifting back to that brief moment on the street. He tried to shake it away. What business did he have thinking about the rancher's daughter? He had enough burdens without adding dreams he could never touch. But as the prairie wind howled against the thin walls, Ethan knew something had shifted inside him. The horizon seemed wider, the air heavier with unspoken promises. He couldn't name it yet, but the story had begun, the kind of story that never let go once it took root. The next morning, the prairie stretched wide under a sky painted with streaks of silver and rose. Ethan rose before his mother stirred, careful not to wake her, and packed a small bundle of bread wrapped in cloth. His boots carried him down the familiar dirt trail toward Carter Ranch, where the promise of a day's wage often outweighed the weight of his weariness. His steps were heavy, but his mind restless, echoing with the memory of a girl's laughter from the day before. Abigail Carter's face lingered in his thoughts like a forbidden flame. He shook his head as if to clear it. She was not for him, never for him. Still, the image would not leave. At the ranch, the morning began with chaos. A bull had broken loose from the corral, sending ranch hands scattering in all directions, their shouts rising above the rumble of hooves. Dust filled the air as men waved ropes, trying in vain to corner the animal. Ethan arrived just in time to see the creature charging across the yard, its horns glinting under the early light. "Grab it, Miller," someone shouted, thrusting a coiled rope toward him. But before Ethan could react, his eyes caught something that froze his blood, a flash of blue fabric. Abigail. She had stepped down from her father's carriage, curiosity carrying her closer to the pens where she should never have been. The bull spotted her first, its massive head lowering, muscles bunching as it prepared to charge. The older chaperone screamed, but her cries were drowned out by the roar of hooves striking dirt. Abigail stood frozen, her hands clutching her skirt, unable to move. Ethan did not think. He ran. The ground thundered beneath him as he sprinted toward her, rope dangling uselessly from his hand. He dropped it, pushing harder, lungs burning, heart pounding louder than the bull's charge. In the split second before disaster struck, Ethan dove, colliding with Abigail and dragging her out of the animal's path. They tumbled across the dirt, the bull swerving with a furious bellow, narrowly missing them by inches. Abigail gasped, clinging to his arm as the dust settled around them, her wide eyes locked onto his, fear fading into stunned wonder. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan struggled to catch his breath, but he managed to steady her, his hand brushing dirt from her sleeve. "You're safe," he said simply, his voice low, firm, carrying a calm he did not feel. Behind them, the ranch hands finally corralled the bull, their lassos snapping tight around its neck. Shouts of victory and laughter followed, but they sounded distant to Ethan. All he could hear was the quick, uneven rhythm of Abigail's breathing beside him. "Miss Carter!" The older woman's voice rang out, shrill with panic. She rushed over, pulling Abigail to her feet, glaring daggers at Ethan as if he had caused the chaos himself. "What were you thinking? Get away from him!" But Abigail resisted, her hand lingering in Ethan's for a heartbeat longer than it should have. "He saved my life," she said, her tone defiant, though her cheeks flushed pink. The words hung in the air, sharp enough to draw the attention of the men nearby. Some smirked, nudging each other, whispering about the poor ranch hand daring to touch the Carter girl. Others watched silently, sensing a storm brewing. Ethan quickly released her hand, stepping back. His chest tightened, not from the sprint but from the weight of those watching eyes. He knew what they saw, a poor hand in worn boots and patched clothes, standing too close to the daughter of the wealthiest rancher in the valley. He bowed his head slightly, as though that small gesture could erase the impropriety of the moment. Jacob Carter arrived seconds later, his tall frame casting a shadow over the ground as he dismounted his horse. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, the bull restrained, the dust settling, and finally, his daughter, standing inches from a hired hand. His jaw tightened, a storm gathering behind his gaze. "What happened here?" His voice cut through the murmurs, cold and heavy. The chaperone hurried forward. "Mr. Carter, your daughter, she was in danger." "That animal nearly," but Abigail interrupted, her chin lifting. "Father, Ethan saved me. If not for him..." Carter's eyes shifted to Ethan, hard and unyielding. The silence stretched long enough to choke. "Is that true?" Ethan straightened his shoulders, meeting the rancher's gaze despite the tremor in his gut. "Yes, sir. She was in the bull's path. I only did what anyone would have done." A humorless smile curved Jacob Carter's lips. "Anyone? Not anyone." He looked Ethan over with deliberate disdain, from his scuffed boots to the dirt smeared across his face. "But you did, didn't you?" "Yes, sir." Carter's tone carried no gratitude, only suspicion, as if Ethan's courage were a crime. He turned to his daughter, his voice sharp. "Get back to the carriage, Abigail, now." Her lips parted as if to protest, but his glare silenced her. She cast one last look at Ethan, her eyes filled with something he could not name, gratitude, curiosity, perhaps something more before she obeyed. As the carriage wheels rattled away, Carter leaned closer to Ethan, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Stay away from her. Do you understand me, Miller?" Ethan's throat tightened, but he nodded once. He knew what line had been drawn, the wall between their worlds now towering higher than ever. Yet as he watched the carriage disappear into the horizon, he also knew something had begun in that moment, something neither threats nor warnings could erase. That night, as Ethan returned home, Mary noticed the distant look in his eyes while he mended the strap of his satchel. She asked gently, "What weighs on your mind, son?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Just the work, Mama, just the work." But in truth, it wasn't the work that haunted him. It was a pair of dark eyes, a voice trembling but defiant, and the memory of her hand refusing to let go. The air around Carter Ranch was still heavy with dust from the bull's frenzy, but inside Jacob Carter's study, the storm that brewed was colder and far more dangerous. The rancher sat behind a grand oak desk, maps of his lands spread before him like trophies of conquest. The tall windows framed the golden fields beyond, but his eyes were locked on the memory of what he had witnessed that morning. His daughter, Abigail, standing too close to a poor hand named Ethan Miller. He leaned back in his leather chair, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling beams. His pride was a fortress, built from years of expanding his ranch, from outlasting rivals and bending the valley to his will. He had no patience for weakness, and certainly no patience for the audacity of a hired boy who thought himself worthy of standing beside his daughter. The door creaked open, and Abigail entered, her steps hesitant yet defiant. The older chaperone hovered outside, uncertain whether to intervene. "Sit," Carter commanded, his voice clipped. Abigail obeyed, though her chin was lifted in quiet resistance. Her father studied her face, the flush of youth, the spark in her eyes that reminded him too much of her late mother. That spark, if left unchecked, could burn everything he had built. "You were reckless today," he began, his tone measured but laced with fury. "You could have been killed." "I wasn't," Abigail replied softly, "because Ethan saved me." The rancher's hand tightened around his cigar. "You will not speak his name in this house." "But he—" "Enough." His voice thundered through the room, making the chaperone outside flinch. "Do you understand what it means for the Carter name to be seen with a Miller boy? He is nothing but a stable hand. His father died with debts. His mother clings to life in a shack barely fit for cattle. And you—" His finger stabbed the air toward her. "You will not disgrace this family by entertaining the idea of gratitude or worse toward him." Abigail's eyes glistened, but she refused to lower them. "I don't care about his clothes or his money. He was brave when no one else moved. Bravery doesn't change blood." Carter's fist slammed against the desk. The maps rattled, and ash from his cigar scattered like gray snow. He leaned forward, his gaze sharp as barbed wire. "Do you want to know what bravery is, girl? Bravery is building a ranch that feeds half this valley. It is signing contracts with men who hold the future of Montana in their hands. Not chasing foolish dreams with a boy who will never have more than dirt beneath his boots." Abigail's voice wavered, but her words struck true. "Maybe the dirt is cleaner than the deals you make." Silence crashed into the room. For the first time in years, Jacob Carter was at a loss for words. The fire in his chest burned hotter, fueled not only by anger but by fear. He saw in his daughter a rebellion that could unravel his control. He would not allow it. "You will not see him again," he declared coldly. "You will be watched more closely, and if I hear even a whisper of you disobeying me, you will regret it." Abigail rose slowly, her hands clenched at her sides. "You can keep me locked behind walls, Father, but you can't control what I feel." Her voice was steady, sharper than he expected. "You can't command my heart like you command your cattle." She turned and walked out, leaving her father staring after her, seething in his chair. The door shut with a soft but final thud, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Later that night, Jacob Carter rode out alone, the moon casting silver light on the pastures. He needed to think. His horse's hooves thudded against the hard earth as he considered how to extinguish this dangerous flame before it grew. It wasn't just about a boy and his daughter, it was about power, respect, and the unyielding order of things. If the valley saw weakness in him, if they thought his daughter could choose a stable hand over alliances with wealthy ranchers, his empire would crumble. He dismounted near a separate corral at the edge of his land. Inside, a massive black stallion pawed the ground, eyes flashing with wild defiance. Thunderstorm. The beast had been purchased at great cost, but no rider had managed to stay on its back for more than a handful of seconds. It was as untamable as the storms that rolled down from the mountains, feared by every hand on the ranch. Jacob Carter's lips curved into a hard smile. Perhaps fate had delivered him the perfect weapon. The next morning, as the ranch bustled with men repairing fences and loading hay, Carter summoned Ethan. The boy approached cautiously, wiping sweat from his brow, his hat in his hands. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Ethan asked, respectful but steady. Carter studied him for a long moment, then leaned closer. "You think yourself brave, Miller. You think saving my daughter makes you a man worth notice." His voice dropped to a cold whisper. "Let's put that bravery to the test." Ethan frowned. "Sir?" Carter's eyes flicked toward the corral where Thunderstorm reared against the posts, a whirlwind of muscle and fury. "You tame that horse," he said, each word deliberate, "and I will give you my daughter." The ranch yard fell silent as the words carried on the wind. The hands nearby stopped what they were doing, jaws slack in disbelief. Abigail, who had been forced to stand beside her chaperone, gasped audibly, her eyes wide with horror. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He looked from Carter's unyielding face to the black stallion thrashing in the pen. Thunderstorm's nostrils flared, and its eyes glared like living fire. Ethan knew instantly what the challenge meant. It wasn't an offer, it was a trap. Yet something inside him, something stronger than fear, rose to meet it. He thought of Abigail's eyes, her hand gripping his in gratitude. He thought of his mother's frail smile and the years of struggle behind them. "I accept," Ethan said, his voice low but resolute. Abigail's cry cut through the silence. "No, Father, you can't." "Enough," Carter snapped, silencing her. The ranch erupted into whispers, wagers already being made among the hands. To them, this was more than a challenge. It was spectacle, drama to fuel their days. But to Ethan, it was destiny. As he walked away, his legs trembling but his jaw set, Abigail's eyes followed him with a mix of terror and awe. Jacob Carter watched too, satisfied. His trap was set, and the fire in his eyes burned brighter than ever. The crowd that gathered near the far corral that afternoon buzzed with the kind of excitement reserved for rodeos or bare-knuckle fights behind the saloon. Word had spread fast through Carter Valley. Jacob Carter had thrown down a challenge, and Ethan Miller, the boy with nothing but worn boots and calloused hands, had accepted. Men leaned against the rails, women shaded their eyes with gloved hands, and children sat on fence posts, eager for a show. Inside the corral, the black stallion known as Thunderstorm pawed the dirt, his muscles rippling like a storm cloud about to break. He was taller than most horses Ethan had ever seen, his coat glistening like polished obsidian under the Sunday. His ears pinned flat, nostrils flaring with every furious snort, and his dark eyes burned with a mixture of rage and fear that set even seasoned ranch hands on edge. "Careful, kid," one of the older cowboys muttered as Ethan approached. "That devil's put better men than you in the dirt." Ethan nodded but didn't answer. His throat was dry, but his resolve was firm. He had faced hardship every day of his life, poverty, hunger, the weight of responsibility for his ailing mother. This horse, wild and dangerous as it was, felt like a mirror of his own struggle. Jacob Carter stood nearby, arms folded, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Show us your courage, Miller," he called out, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Or perhaps show us your foolishness." The gate creaked open, and Ethan stepped into the corral. A hush fell across the onlookers. Thunderstorm froze for an intonation, instant, head high, then lunged forward with terrifying speed. Ethan barely had time to dive aside before the stallion's chest slammed into the space where he had stood. Dust exploded into the air as the animal spun, hooves striking the ground like thunder. The crowd gasped, a few men cheering at the spectacle. Abigail, forced to watch from behind her chaperone, gripped the fence rail until her knuckles turned white. "Stop this," she whispered, but her voice was drowned by the noise. Ethan scrambled to his feet, pain shooting through his shoulder where he'd hit the ground. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, his voice calm though his heart raced. "Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." Thunderstorm snorted, ears flicking, circling him with deliberate menace. Every line of the horse's body screamed defiance. Then, without warning, the stallion charged again. Ethan braced for the impact, but instead of fighting back, he sidestepped at the last second, letting the horse barrel past him. The crowd roared with laughter and jeers. 5 seconds, someone shouted. I told you he wouldn't last. But Ethan didn't leave the corral. He stood tall, brushing dirt from his hands, and fixed his gaze on the stallion. He didn't see a monster, he saw an animal driven by fear, by memories of cruelty he could only guess at. Instead of reaching for a rope or a whip, he lowered himself slowly to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the dust. The crowd fell into uneasy murmurs. What kind of fool sat down in front of a raging beast? Thunderstorm stopped pacing, ears swiveling as if confused by the sudden lack of aggression. He snorted, pawed the earth, but didn't charge. His eyes locked on Ethan, who remained still, speaking in a low, steady tone. I know you don't trust me. I wouldn't either. But I'm not here to break you. I'm here to listen. Minutes stretched like hours. The stallion circled warily, never taking his eyes off the boy in the pressures. Dirt. Ethan's shoulder throbbed. Sweat ran down his temple, but he didn't move. Slowly, the tension in the air shifted. Thunderstorm lowered his head slightly, not in surrender but in wary acknowledgement. From the fence, Pancho, the grizzled foreman, leaned toward another cowboy. I've seen a lot of men try to ride that horse, he said quietly. None of them ever thought to sit down. Jacob Carter scowled, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. This was not the show of humiliation he had intended. At last, Ethan rose carefully to his feet, giving Thunderstorm space. The stallion's ears twitched forward, and though he remained tense, he didn't attack again. Ethan offered a small nod, almost like a promise. Tomorrow, he whispered, we'll try again. When he walked out of the corral, bruised but unbroken, the crowd erupted into clashing voices, some mocking, some astonished. Abigail's heart pounded with pride and fear. She had seen something her father refused to acknowledge, a connection beginning, fragile but undeniable. Jacob Carter barked an order to the men, dispersing the crowd. Yet even as he sneered at Ethan, calling him a fool, he felt a knot of doubt twist in his chest. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps the boy had more than stubbornness on his side. That night, Ethan returned to the small cabin, his shirt torn, his body aching. His mother looked up from her chair by the stove, her eyes wide with worry. What have you gotten yourself into, son? Ethan knelt beside her, taking her frail hand. Something I can't walk away from, Mama. His voice was steady, though his body trembled with exhaustion. For her, for us, and maybe even for that horse. Outside, under the Montana moon, Thunderstorm stood restless in his pen, snorting into the night air. He had not forgotten the boy's calm voice, nor the way the boy had refused to fight. The battle between man and beast had only just begun. The following days carried a different kind of electricity through Carter Valley. News of Ethan Miller's first encounter with Thunderstorm spread like wildfire, spilling from the saloon to the church steps, whispered at kitchen tables and shouted across cattle pens. Some laughed at the notion that the poor boy had lasted even minutes inside the corral. Others, quieter but more curious, wondered if there was something unusual in the way Thunderstorm hadn't struck him down after the first charge. Every morning, when Ethan made his way back to the Carter ranch, heads turned. Men tipped their hats with mocking smiles, women shook their heads with pity, and children followed him for a stretch, daring each other to ask when he would ride the black beast. He endured it all with silence, his eyes set on the horizon, his heart heavy but unyielding. By the fifth dawn, the corral was ringed not only by ranch hands but by townsfolk who had ridden out just to witness the spectacle. Some came with wagers clinking in their pockets, eager to profit from his failure. Others came out of curiosity, pulled by the tail of a stable hand, daring to claim the Carter girl's future. Tommy Reed, Ethan's lifelong friend, pushed through the crowd, carrying a sack of oats and a crooked grin. You've stirred up quite the storm, Ethan, he said, clapping him on the back. Half the valley thinks you're insane. The other half's hoping you prove 'em wrong. Ethan managed a faint smile. And what do you think? Tommy studied him, his grin fading into something steadier. I think you're the stubbornest mule I've ever known. And if anyone can do it, it's you. From the opposite side of the corral, Sheriff Collins leaned against a post, his hat pulled low, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of straw. He didn't speak much, but his eyes never left Ethan as the boy stepped into the dust once more. The sheriff had seen enough men fight horses with whips and spurs to know cruelty never worked. Something about Ethan's quiet patience tugged at him, though he'd never admit it aloud. Abigail, of course, was there too. Her father allowed her no freedom, but she always found a way to slip near the corral, her chaperone close at her heels. Her heart leapt every time Thunderstorm reared or lunged, but her eyes never wavered from Ethan. She saw the bruises on his arms, the torn sleeve from yesterday's fall, and she prayed silently, clutching the rail so tightly her knuckles ached. The stallion's fury did not ease easily. He bared his teeth, lashed out with his hooves, and tested Ethan's courage at every turn. But Ethan refused to fight back. Day after day he stayed low, his voice steady, his movements measured. Some mocked his methods, calling him the preacher boy or the horse whisperer. Yet slowly, so slowly that most failed to notice, Thunderstorm's circles grew less frantic, his pauses longer when Ethan spoke. It wasn't just the horse that was watching, so were the people. Pancho, the grizzled foreman, squinted through the dust. "He ain't like the others," he muttered to a hand beside him. "He ain't trying to break the horse, he's trying to reach it," the hand snorted. "Reaching ain't riding." Pancho didn't reply, but a spark of curiosity glimmered in his weathered eyes. The ranch yard had become a theater, and Ethan, its reluctant actor. He could feel the weight of every gaze, every whispered bet, every expectation pressing down on him. At night, when he returned home, his mother would scold his injuries and plead with him to quit. Yet when she looked into his eyes, she saw the fire there, the same fire she had seen in her husband years ago, and she knew words could not stop him. One evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the last rays of sun painted the valley in copper light, Abigail found a chance to approach. She slipped from her chaperone's side under the pretense of fetching water and hurried to the fence where Ethan rested, his back against the rail, his shirt damp with sweat. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing toward the house where Jacob Carter's shadow loomed large even in absence. "I had to see you," she replied, her voice trembling. "Every time you step into that corral, I'm terrified." Ethan looked down at his bruised hands, dirt ground into every crease. "So am I, but I can't stop now." Her eyes softened, and for a moment the world around them faded, the dust, the weight of her father's empire, the gossip of the valley. She reached through the slats of the fence and brushed her fingers against his. "Then don't fight for him. Fight for yourself, for us." Before Ethan could answer, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Miss Carter." The chaperone stood rigid, fury etched across her face. Abigail snatched back her hand, her cheeks flushed, and hurried away without another word. Ethan watched her go, his chest tight with both longing and dread. He knew the danger they both courted, but her words lingered like embers refusing to die. The next morning, as he returned to the ranch, he noticed more people waiting than ever before. Wagers doubled, laughter louder, the anticipation of either triumph or disaster feeding the crowd. He swallowed hard, feeling the press of expectation heavier than the Montana sky. Yet when his eyes found Thunderstorm, standing restless in the corral with dust swirling around his black coat, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The stallion was no longer just a beast to tame. He was a living mirror of Ethan's own fight, a creature scarred, mistrustful, but not beyond redemption. The onlookers thought they came for entertainment. Ethan knew he came for something far greater. The valley had always whispered, but now it roared with gossip. From the saloon in town to the pews of the small chapel, Ethan Miller's name was on every tongue. Some spoke it with mockery, others with grudging admiration, and a few with quiet hope. But inside Carter Ranch, where the air was heavy with pride and control, Ethan's persistence was a thorn Jacob Carter could not ignore. Jacob stood on the porch one evening, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last glow of sun bled into the mountains. He had thought the challenge would humble the boy, would rid him of foolish dreams. Instead, Ethan had returned day after day, drawing crowds larger than any rodeo Carter had ever hosted. The more people watched, the more dangerous the game became. If the boy succeeded, it would not only disgrace Jacob, it would weaken his grip on the valley. He turned to Bill Hansen, his foreman and most loyal hand. Bill was a thick-shouldered man with a crooked smile and eyes that gleamed with opportunism. He had carried out Carter's dirty work before quietly, efficiently, without question. "Thunderstorm cannot be tamed," Jacob said flatly, his voice low enough not to carry beyond the porch. "And if the boy keeps trying, the crowd might start believing otherwise. I will not have my daughter's future or my name dictated by a stable hand's stubbornness. Bill tilted his hat back, spitting into the dirt. What are you asking, sir? I'm asking, Jacob said, leaning close, that you make sure Miller never succeeds. Subtle, Hanson. If he fails, it must look like his own weakness. No one must trace it back to us. Bill's smile widened. Consider it done. That night, under the cover of darkness, Bill crept toward the corral. The moon was thin, a sliver in the black sky, but enough to glint off the iron nails he carried in his hand. He scattered them across the packed dirt where Ethan often sat, sharp points hidden beneath a thin layer of dust. Any misstep, any stumble, and both horse and man would bleed. He chuckled softly, certain that no one would ever suspect. But he wasn't alone. From a shadowed corner Abigail watched, her breath caught in her chest. She had slipped from her room through the kitchen door, desperate to breathe air beyond the suffocating watch of her chaperone. What she saw instead made her blood run cold. Bill Hanson crouched inside the corral, planting danger with every flick of his wrist. Abigail's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to rush at him, but instinct told her silence was her only weapon. She waited until he was gone, his heavy boots fading into the night. Then, with trembling hands, she slipped through the fence and dropped to her knees in the dust. One by one, she pulled the nails from the ground, wincing as the sharp edges sliced her fingers. Blood smeared across her skin, but she didn't stop until every glint of metal was gone. When she was finished, she leaned against the fence, her breath ragged, tears streaking her cheeks. "Ethan," she whispered into the dark, her voice breaking, "they'll do anything to stop you." At dawn, Ethan arrived, as he always did, carrying a small pouch of carrots and sugar cubes. He paused when he saw Abigail waiting near the corral, her hands hidden beneath a handkerchief spotted with red. "What happened?" he asked, alarm rising in his voice. She shook her head quickly. "Nothing. Just be careful, please." Her eyes held his for a moment, desperate, then darted toward the house. "I can't stay." Before he could press her further, she was gone, swept back into the shadows of her father's domain. That morning, as Ethan stepped into the corral, he noticed small patches of disturbed dirt, as if the ground had been tampered with. He crouched, sifting through the soil until he found the faint trace of a nail tip glinting in the light. His jaw tightened. Someone wanted him hurt, or worse. He lifted his eyes to Thunderstorm, who pawed the earth uneasily, nostrils flaring as if he too sensed the lingering danger. Ethan stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his breaded hands. "They won't break us," he murmured to the stallion. "Not you, not me." From the fence, the onlookers shouted wagers and insults, oblivious to the shadows at play. Sheriff Collins watched with narrowed eyes, his suspicion growing as he caught the faint glimmer of blood on Abigail's handkerchief when she passed. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Inside the corral, Ethan began again, low voice, steady presence, patience against the storm. He knew now that he wasn't fighting only the fear inside the horse. He was fighting the deceit that lurked in the shadows, the cruelty of men who feared change more than failure. And as the crowd roared around him, Ethan made a silent vow. He would not let them win. Not Jacob Carter, not Bill Hanson, not anyone who believed fear was stronger than trust. The prairie mornings had a way of settling into Ethan's bones, cold, sharp, and honest. On the 7th day of his trial, he rose before dawn, listening to the wind hum against the thin walls of the cabin. His mother still slept, her breath shallow but steady, and he took a quiet moment by the stove, recalling how she used to sing him lullabies when storms rattled the windows. Those songs had been his comfort in boyhood, and now, strangely, they stirred again in his mind as he prepared for another battle with the black stallion. When Ethan arrived at Carter Ranch, the crowd was already gathering. Dust rose beneath wagon wheels, voices carried across the fields, and the corral was ringed with expectant faces. Bets were exchanged, jokes flung carelessly, and yet all eyes sharpened the moment Ethan walked past the rails. He no longer looked like just a hand in patched clothes. He carried the weight of a man on a mission, though bruises and cuts marked his body. Thunderstorm waited inside, restless, stamping at the dirt. His black coat gleamed like midnight under the morning sun, muscles taut, eyes burning with the same mistrust that had haunted every meeting. Ethan studied him for a long moment, then did something that caught the crowd off guard. He sat down outside the fence, The murmurs began at once. "What's he doing? Too scared to go in?" "Waste of time." Laughter rippled, but Ethan ignored it. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a small harmonica, and lifted it to his lips. The first notes floated out soft and low, a melody as old as the prairie itself. The tune had no words, but its rhythm carried the rise and fall of long nights and early mornings, of sorrow and hope braided together. It was the same melody his mother had hummed when the roof leaked rain, when cupboards were bare, when his father never came home. At first, Thunderstorm's ears twitched in irritation. He pawed the ground, snorted, and swung his head with agitation. But as the melody wound through the morning air, something shifted. The stallion slowed, his ears pricking forward. His steps lost some of their violence, replaced by curiosity. The crowd quieted too, uneasy. They had expected shouts, whips, and chaos, not music drifting across the rails. Even Pancho, leaning on his cane, straightened with surprise. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. Ethan lowered the harmonica and spoke softly. "You hear it, don't you? It's not a command, just a story, my story. Maybe it sounds a little like yours." The stallion blew through his nostrils, head tossing, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he edged closer to the fence, his massive frame shifting with hesitant steps. The murmurs rose again, disbelief passing from face to face. Then Ethan did something bolder. He stepped into the corral, still holding the harmonica. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Abigail's breath caught, her heart hammered against her ribs. Sheriff Collins adjusted his stance, hand brushing the butt of his revolver, as though instinctively preparing for chaos. But chaos didn't come. Ethan lifted the harmonica again, letting the melody guide his movements. Each note was a thread, weaving calm through the stallion's nerves. Thunderstorm's eyes never left him, watching with intensity but without the wild charge that had defined their first encounter. Step by step, the distance between them closed until Ethan could see the dust clinging to the stallion's lashes, the faint white scars along his flank. He lowered the harmonica and spoke barely above a whisper. "You've been hurt. I can see it. I've been hurt too, but we're still standing." The stallion blew air sharply through his nostrils, then stilled. For the first time, he didn't rear, didn't attack, he simply stood, tense but present. Ethan didn't push further. He knew trust wasn't taken in a single day. He simply bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect. The crowd erupted into argument. Some called it a trick. Others insisted the horse had never stood so still before. Jacob Carter, watching from the porch, clenched his jaw. He had planned on Ethan's humiliation, but what he saw unsettled him deeply. This wasn't failure, it was progress, and progress threatened his grip more than defeat ever could. As the crowd dispersed, Abigail found a sliver of courage. She lingered near the fence as Ethan collected his satchel. "You're reaching him," she whispered, her eyes shining with quiet awe. "I can see it." Ethan shook his head, though a faint smile touched his lips. "Not yet, but maybe someday." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the weight of their world, the rancher's fury, the valley's gossip, the looming danger faded. It was only a girl and a boy, bound by something neither could deny. That night, alone in the cabin, Ethan cleaned the cuts on his hands while his mother dozed by the fire. He lifted the harmonica again, playing softly into the shadows. The notes filled the room, fragile but unbroken, just like him. And out in the dark corral, Thunderstorm stood silent, ears pricked to the distant tune, carried by the prairie wind. The prairie sun was merciless that morning, beating down on the Carter ranch with the same weight as the stares of the valley folk who gathered once again around the corral. By now, the spectacle had become a ritual. Men leaned on the rails with tin cups of coffee, women shielded their faces with parasols, and the children whispered excitedly, as though this trial of boy against beast were a chapter out of some grand tale. But Ethan's eyes were not on the crowd. They were on Thunderstorm. The stallion stood restless in the corral, dark coat gleaming with sweat, tail swishing with irritation. Yet his defiance had changed, less wild rage, more watchful caution. The music of yesterday still lingered in his memory. Ethan could see it in the way the horse's ears flicked when he raised the harmonica again, even before the first note played. This time, however, Ethan didn't lift the instrument to his lips. He simply stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The crowd hushed, waiting for violence, for the horse to lash out. But Thunderstorm merely pawed the dirt, nostrils flaring. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the jagged white marks tracing the stallion's flank. Scars. He had noticed them before, faint lines glinting in the sun, but now he saw them differently. They weren't the random scrapes of a wild animal, they were deliberate, cruel, carved by human hands. Ethan's jaw tightened as realization struck. This horse hadn't been born vicious, he had been made that way. Later, while the crowd dispersed and wagers were settled, Ethan sought out Pancho near the stables. The old foreman was mending a bridle, his weathered fingers moving with the patience of decades. "Pancho," Ethan said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one else was listening. "You know more about Thunderstorm than you let on, don't you?" The old man didn't look up. "Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I've seen the scars," Ethan pressed. "Those aren't from the wild. Someone did that to him. I need to know the truth." Pancho sighed, finally raising his eyes. They were tired eyes, but steady. "Careful, boy. Truth's a dangerous thing on this ranch." "Please," Ethan urged. "If I don't understand what he's been through, I'll never reach him." For a long moment, Pancho said nothing. Then, lowering his voice, he began. "Thunderstorm wasn't always called that. He came here from Wyoming, sold cheap by a traveling trader. Word was, he'd been part of a cruel show, forced to perform tricks, whipped when he resisted, starved when he didn't obey. He fought back, and the men fought harder. Spurs, lashes, iron. Those scars you saw, they're the map of his suffering." Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs. He had suspected mistreatment, but hearing it aloud pierced him. "No wonder he doesn't trust anyone," he whispered. Pancho nodded grimly. "He learned that humans mean pain. Every time someone comes at him with force, he remembers. That's why he fights." The truth settled like a weight on Ethan's shoulders, but it wasn't despair, it was clarity. He finally understood that Thunderstorm wasn't a beast to be conquered. He was a wounded soul, desperate for someone to show him that not all hands struck with cruelty. That evening, after the others had gone, Ethan returned to the corral alone. The sky was painted in strokes of violet and gold, the prairie quiet except for the rustle of grass. Thunderstorm stood at the far end, watching warily as Ethan climbed onto the fence and perched there, harmonica in hand. He didn't play right away. Instead, he spoke, his voice carrying across the quiet. "I know they hurt you. I know you don't have a reason to trust me. But I've been hurt too. My father's gone. My mother's sick. Sometimes I think the world's done nothing but take." His voice cracked, but he steadied. But I'm still here, and so are you. Maybe that means something." Thunderstorm's ears twitched. He didn't move closer, but he didn't turn away either. Ethan lifted the harmonica and played, soft and low, weaving his confession into the melody. The stallion shifted, his muscles tense, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lowered his head. From the shadows near the barn, Abigail watched, her heart swelling with a mixture of sorrow and hope. She had never seen anyone speak to a horse like that, as though speaking to a brother instead of a beast. She pressed a hand to her lips, holding back tears. The song faded with the last of the daylight. Ethan set the harmonica aside and climbed down from the fence. He didn't try to touch Thunderstorm. He didn't need to. Tonight had not been about victory, it had been about truth. And for the first time, he felt the fragile thread of connection pulling tighter. When he returned home, his mother was awake, sitting by the fire with her quilt across her lap. "Long day?" she asked gently. Ethan knelt beside her, resting his head against her shoulder. "Long," he admitted, "but I think I understand him now." She stroked his hair with trembling fingers. "Sometimes, son, the scars we carry aren't just reminders of pain. They're proof that we survived." Ethan closed his eyes, her words sinking deep. Yes, Thunderstorm had survived, and so had he. Together, maybe they could find something more than survival. Outside, the night wind swept across the prairie, rattling the grass like the memory of old chains. But in the corral, Thunderstorm stood quietly, scars gleaming pale under the moon, as though waiting for the boy who saw them not as shame but as truth. The prairie was quiet after dusk, but the Carter household simmered with tension. Abigail had overheard fragments of her father's late-night meeting with a man she recognized as Richard Morgan, heir to one of the largest ranches in the Mentally, neighboring county. Their voices carried through the study's half-open door, muffled but clear enough to freeze her blood. "Your daughter will marry Richard by the end of summer," Jacob Carter said, his tone flat, final. "The boy Miller won't matter by then. The contract between our lands is already signed." Abigail stumbled back into the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every step she had taken in defiance, every stolen glance with Ethan, every whispered word near the corral, suddenly seemed crushed beneath her father's calculated betrayal. Her stomach turned as she realized. All along, he had never intended to honor his promise. The next day, Ethan came to the corral with the same quiet determination that had carried him through the week. He greeted Thunderstorm softly, offering a cube of sugar through the rails. The stallion sniffed, hesitant but no longer furious. For a brief moment, Ethan felt hope steady in his chest. That was when Abigail appeared, her face pale, her steps hurried. She moved as though chased by the very walls of her home, her eyes darting nervously toward the ranch house before fixing on him. "Ethan," she whispered, gripping the rail, "you need to know the truth." His brow furrowed. "What is it?" "My father, he doesn't mean to keep his word. He's already promised me to Richard Morgan. The papers are signed." Her voice cracked. "This challenge was never about giving you a chance. It was a trap to humiliate you, to crush you." The sugar cube crumbled in Ethan's palm. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The weight of her words pressed down harder than any blow he had ever taken. He had endured jeers, bruises, and exhaustion, fueled by the vision of a future where he could win her hand through sheer resolve. Now that vision shattered. Then everything, his throat tightened. "Everything I've done has been for nothing?" Abigail's eyes brimmed with tears. "Number, not for nothing. You've reached Thunderstorm in ways no one believed possible. You've shown the whole valley your strength. But my father, he'll never allow us." Ethan stepped back, shaking his head. "Strength doesn't feed my mother. It doesn't change the fact that I'm just a poor hand. And it doesn't matter if the whole valley believes in me, if the man with the power never will." "Don't say that," Abigail pleaded, her fingers tightening around the rail. "Don't give him the satisfaction." But Ethan's chest felt hollow. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Maybe he was right all along. Maybe I'm nothing more than dirt under his boots. That night, Ethan sat outside the cabin, staring at the stars while his mother dozed inside. His hands still carried the sting of rope burns and cuts, but deeper wounds festered unseen. He thought of his father, who had died working cattle for another man's fortune. Was Ethan destined to follow the same path, laboring until his body broke, leaving nothing behind but debts and disappointment? Tommy arrived quietly, carrying a jug of water. "You look like hell, Ethan," he said, lowering himself onto the step. "What's eating at you?" Ethan didn't answer right away. At last he muttered, "It was never real. Carter never meant it. Abigail's already promised away." Tommy cursed under his breath. "That old snake. I knew he was playing at something." "It doesn't matter," Ethan said, his voice dull. "Even if I tame Thunderstorm, nothing changes. I'll always be the poor hand who thought he could reach too high." Tommy's jaw tightened. "That horse trusts you, Ethan, more than he's trusted anyone in his life. That's not nothing." But Ethan shook his head. "Trust doesn't build a future. Maybe it's time I stop chasing what I can't have." For 2 days, Ethan didn't return to the corral. Thunderstorm grew restless, pacing, snorting at the absence of the boy who had become part of his world. The crowds, deprived of their spectacle, grew bored and drifted away, muttering that the show was over. Jacob Carter smirked, certain the boy had finally broken. Abigail, however, could not rest. She tried to send notes, slipping them through Tommy, but Ethan ignored them. Her chest ached with helplessness, watching the corral stand empty, the stallion's frustration mirroring her own. At home, Mary Miller watched her son with quiet sorrow. She saw him drift like a ghost, shoulders bowed under invisible weight. One evening, she placed her frail hand on his arm. "You can walk away from her if you must," she said softly, "but don't walk away from yourself. You've already proven you're more than the world says you are." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to respond. He wanted to believe her, but the walls of his heart felt too high, too heavy. And yet, in the dark corral that night, Thunderstorm stood restless beneath the stars, ears pricked toward the empty path where Ethan used to appear at dawn. The stallion pawed the dirt, blowing sharp breaths, as though he too was waiting for the boy who had once promised he would not leave. The cabin felt smaller than ever, its walls pressing in as if they could sense the weight on Ethan's shoulders. He hadn't stepped foot near the Carter corral in 2 days, and the silence of his absence was louder than the roar of any crowd. His boots stayed by the door, dusty but untouched. His hands, once steady and sure, lay limp across his knees as he sat by the fire, staring at nothing. Mary Miller watched him from her chair, her quilt folded neatly across her lap, Her face, pale and lined with years of struggle, carried an expression Ethan knew too well. Worry held in silence. She had always been careful not to burden him more than life already had, but tonight she could not hold back. "You haven't said a word all evening," she said softly, her voice rasping but steady. Ethan rubbed his temples, unable to meet her eyes. "What's left to say? It was all a lie, Mama. Carter never intended to keep his word. Abigail's promised away. Everything I've been doing, it doesn't matter anymore." Mary's lips pressed into a thin line. Slowly, with effort, she rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him. Her hand, frail but warm, found his. "So that's it? You'll quit because a man like Jacob Carter lied? You'll let him decide who you are?" Ethan shook his head, frustration rising. "I fought for something I can't have. I've been fooling myself, thinking I could change the way the world works. He's right, I'm just a hand, no land, no money. I can't give Abigail the life she deserves." Mary's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Don't you dare talk like that. You think a life is measured in land and cattle. I've seen men with more acres than they can count who are emptier than dry wells. What you carry, Ethan, is worth more than Carter's empire." He finally looked at her, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "And what's that?" "Your heart," she answered simply. "Your patience, your kindness. Those things tamed you long before you ever thought of taming that horse. And don't tell me it doesn't matter, you've already changed that animal. The whole valley saw it. If you give up now, you're proving Carter right when he says you're nothing. Is that the man you want to be?" Her words struck deeper than any insult Jacob Carter had ever thrown. Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tight. He thought of Thunderstorm pacing the corral, restless, waiting. He thought of Abigail's desperate eyes, begging him not to surrender. And he thought of his father, who had died working until his body gave out, but whose quiet courage lived on in Ethan's own hands. "I don't know if I can win," he admitted. Mary cupped his face, her thumb brushing the edge of his jaw. "Winning isn't the point. Finishing, Island. Show yourself that you don't bend because the world tries to break you. Finish what you started, Ethan." For the first time in days, he felt a spark stir in his chest. It wasn't hope exactly, but something sturdier resolve. He pressed his mother's hand to his lips and nodded. "I'll finish it. For you. For him. For me." The next morning, the sky broke open in a blaze of gold as Ethan walked the familiar trail back to the Carter ranch. His steps were firm, his head high. When he reached the corral, murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. Some had believed he'd quit for good. Others had bet money he would never return. But there he was, dust rising at his heels, eyes locked on Thunderstorm. The stallion lifted his head the moment Ethan appeared, snorting sharply, ears pricked forward. He pawed the ground, as if to say, "You're late." Ethan stepped onto the rail and leaned forward, his voice carrying low and steady. "I'm here, boy. I won't leave you again." The murmurs grew louder as he dropped into the corral, moving with calm that surprised even himself. Thunderstorm watched him warily but didn't charge. Instead, he circled, muscles taut, testing Ethan's presence. Ethan didn't push. He simply stood his ground, speaking softly, letting his voice fill the space between them. Hours passed. The crowd thinned as the sun climbed high, but Ethan remained, patient as the prairie itself. He spoke of his father, of nights hungry and cold, of his mother's songs and her strength. The stallion listened in his own way, circling slower, his breathing easing. When Ethan finally stepped closer, Thunderstorm didn't bolt. For the first time, Ethan extended his hand fully. The stallion's nostrils flared, hot breath brushing Ethan's skin, and though the touch never came, the gap between them had narrowed to nothing more than trust waiting to bloom. At the rail, Abigail pressed her hands to her lips, eyes shining. Pancho leaned on his cane and whispered, "That boy ain't fighting for Carter anymore. He's fighting for himself." And above them all, Jacob Carter stood on the porch, arms crossed, his jaw tight. For the first time, he saw not a foolish hand chasing a dream, but a man who might actually win it. That evening, when Ethan returned to the cabin, Mary greeted him at the door. He knelt beside her chair, dirt clinging to his clothes, exhaustion weighing him down. She smiled faintly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "You kept your word," she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes and let her hand rest there, steady as the prairie itself. He hadn't won yet, but for the first time, he believed he could. The morning of the trial dawned sharp and clear, the Montana sky painted in an unforgiving blue. Long before the sun rose fully over the mountains, wagons rattled down the dusty road toward Carter Ranch. Riders in wide-brimmed hats trotted alongside, and by mid-morning the yard was a festival of tension. Vendors set up stands of jerky and lemonade, while a few gamblers nailed a chalkboard against a post, scrawling odds beside Ethan's name and thunderstorms. The corral had never seen such a crowd. Families arrived from neighboring valleys, men eager for the spectacle, women clutching shawls against the morning chill, and children who perched like sparrows along the fences. The low hum of anticipation carried across the ranch like static before a storm. Ethan walked through it all with the quiet of a man who had already faced his demons. His shirt was clean, though frayed at the collar, his boots polished as best he could manage. In his pocket was the harmonica, not as a trick but as a reminder of where he'd come from. Each step toward the corral felt like walking into the center of his own story, and he carried it with a calm that surprised even him. Near the gate, Tommy Reed clapped him on the back. "They're ready to see you fall or fly, brother," he said with a crooked grin. "Just don't give 'em the easy show." Ethan smirked faintly, though his chest was tight. "I don't aim to." Abigail stood near the porch under the strict watch of her chaperone, her dark eyes never leaving him. Her hands clutched the folds of her dress, but her chin was lifted, defiant even in silence. When their eyes met, the noise of the crowd dulled. In that glance, Ethan felt the weight of what was at stake, not just her, not just the horse, but the chance to prove that a man's worth could not be measured by wealth or land. Jacob Carter strode onto the porch, his presence commanding immediate silence. He raised a hand for the crowd to quiet, his voice carrying with the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Today," he declared, "we witness whether this boy dares call himself a man. He claims he can tame the beast no one else has ridden. Let all present bear witness to his success or his failure." The gate groaned as it swung open, and Ethan stepped inside. The hush that fell was so deep he could hear the dust crunch under his boots. Thunderstorm stood in the center of the corral, massive and magnificent, his black coat gleaming, his breath rising in clouds. His eyes locked on Ethan, nostrils flaring with suspicion. Every muscle in his body quivered with potential violence. Ethan inhaled, steadying his nerves. "I'm here, boy," he murmured. "Just you and me." The stallion reared suddenly, hooves slashing at the air. Gasps rose from the crowd. Ethan didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply lifted his voice, calm and low, the same way he had each dawn when no one else watched. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the harmonica from his pocket and pressed it to his lips. The tune drifted out, soft and steady, weaving through the charged silence. Thunderstorm's ears flicked forward. His hooves struck the dirt again, but his eyes softened, his breathing slowing as he listened. The crowd murmured, astonished. "He's playing to it. Never seen the beast stand still that long." Ethan lowered the harmonica, pocketing it again. Step by step, he closed the distance, speaking all the while. "They called you a monster. They scarred you, broke you, tried to bend you with pain. But I see you. I know what it is to carry scars. I won't hurt you. Not now. Not ever." Thunderstorm pawed the ground, tossing his head, but he didn't charge. Instead, his body trembled with indecision, caught between memory and possibility. Ethan reached out a hand, palm open. The stallion snorted, breath hot against Ethan's skin, and for one suspended moment, the world held its breath. Then, against all expectation, Thunderstorm lowered his head. The crowd gasped, a ripple of awe sweeping across the ranch. Ethan let his hand brush the stallion's mane, light as a feather. The touch was brief but undeniable. He whispered, "It's you and me now." But Jacob Carter, standing rigid on the porch, felt fury coil in his chest. This was not the humiliation he had orchestrated. This was a boy turning the crowd against him with nothing more than patience and trust. His jaw tightened as whispers rose among the onlookers, voices marveling at Ethan's calm, his connection. "Ride him," someone shouted. "Prove it!" another voice cried. Ethan hesitated. He knew this moment wasn't about domination, it was about trust earned, not stolen. But he also knew the crowd demanded more. He glanced at Abigail, who gave the faintest nod, her eyes filled with faith. He moved carefully, pressing his hands against Thunderstorm's flank, easing his weight as he swung a leg over. The stallion tensed, muscles coiled like a spring. For an instant, Ethan thought he'd be thrown. Then, Thunderstorm stilled. The corral erupted with noise, cheers, disbelief, the thunder of hands clapping against rails. Ethan sat astride the stallion, not as a conqueror but as a companion. He leaned low, whispering, "We're in this together." But Jacob Carter's face darkened. He turned abruptly, barking orders at Bill Hansen, his foreman. The words didn't carry, but the intent was clear. If Ethan's success could not be stopped by force, it would be undermined by deceit. As Ethan guided Thunderstorm in a slow, deliberate circle, the crowd rose to their feet. Sheriff Collins stepped closer, arms crossed, watching Carter's movements with suspicion. He didn't know what the rancher planned, but he knew a storm was coming. For now, though, Ethan rode beneath the open sky, his heart pounding with triumph, with fear, with the sense that everything his mother, Abigail, the stallion, his very soul balanced on this fragile moment of trust. The day of judgment had come, and though the battle was far from over, Ethan had taken his first victory. The corral still vibrated with noise long after Ethan had settled onto Thunderstorm's back. The valley folk stomped the rails, their voices rising in disbelief and awe. It was not the wild spectacle they had expected, with a boy thrown into the dust and a beast raging above him. It was quieter, almost reverent, one human and one animal bound together by something stronger than fear. But Jacob Carter was not moved by reverence. On the porch, his jaw clenched as he watched Ethan guide the stallion in slow circles, steady as though they had been partners for years. Whispers rippled through the crowd, praise for the boy who had done what no seasoned rancher could. It was worse than humiliation, it was admiration. Carter's empire had been built on strength and intimidation, and now his own challenge was being undone by a boy's patience. His gaze snapped to Bill Hansen. "Give me your whip," he muttered. Bill hesitated. "Sir, now." The foreman obeyed, handing over the braided leather, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Carter gripped it tightly, his face twisting into something darker than anger. Ethan sensed the shift before he saw it. Thunderstorm's ears flicked, his muscles tightening beneath Ethan's legs. Then the crack split the air. The whip lashed near the stallion's flank, sharp and sudden like lightning tearing the sky. Thunderstorm reared violently, nearly unseating Ethan, his scream of terror echoing through the valley. The crowd gasped, outrage mingling with fear. "Father, no!" Abigail cried, rushing forward, but her chaperone clutched her arm, holding her back. Ethan clung to Thunderstorm's mane, his voice steady despite the panic in his chest. "Easy, boy, easy. It's just noise, it can't hurt you. I'm here, I've got you." Another crack of the whip tore through the air, closer this time. Thunderstorm's eyes rolled white, his body trembling with the memory of pain etched deep into his scars. He twisted, bucking, desperate to escape the ghosts Carter had conjured. But Ethan held firm, not with spurs or reins, but with his voice. He leaned close to the stallion's ear, whispering against the chaos. "You're not alone, not anymore. They can't break you, they can't break us." The whip snapped again, the sound slicing like fire, but Ethan did not flinch. He loosened his grip instead, showing Thunderstorm he trusted him even in the storm. For a long, agonizing moment, the stallion reared high, hooves pouring at the sky. Then, with a shudder that rattled through his frame, he came down firm but calm. His sides heaved, nostrils flaring, but his head lowered ever so slightly. The crowd erupted, their outrage now boiling over. "That's cheating," someone shouted. "Let the boy ride," another voice rang out. "We all saw he won fair." Sheriff Collins stepped forward, his hand raised for silence. His voice, deep and steady, carried across the corral. "Enough, Carter. The boy's proven himself. Don't turn this into a farce." But Jacob Carter's pride was too thick, his fury too consuming. "A truly tamed horse doesn't spook at a whip," he barked, his voice shaking with desperation. Ethan turned in the saddle, his voice rising above the din. "A truly tamed horse doesn't need to fear one in the first place." He looked straight at Carter, his eyes fierce. "You can break an animal with pain, but you'll never earn its heart that way. I have, and that's stronger than anything you've ever built." Thunderstorm shifted beneath him, steady now, as though affirming Ethan's words. Abigail's tears streaked her cheeks, her hands clasped against her chest. Pancho tipped his hat low, muttering with pride, "That boy's teaching us all." Carter's face flushed red, the whip trembling in his grip. He looked around and saw the crowd's eyes no longer on him but on Ethan, eyes filled with respect, admiration, even love. And for the first time in years, Jacob Carter felt his power slip like sand through clenched fists. The sheriff took a step closer, his voice like a warning bell. "Put down the whip, Carter. You've lost. For a long, tense moment, Carter's pride battled against the truth burning in every gaze around him. Finally, with a curse, he dropped the whip into the dirt. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forehead briefly against Thunderstorm's mane. The stallion huffed, his breath hot but steady, his body trembling less. "We did it," Ethan whispered. "We faced the storm." The crowd roared in approval, but Ethan barely heard. All he felt was the solid strength beneath him, the trust he had fought to earn, and the truth that no whip, no man, no empire could undo what had been built between them. And yet, as he guided Thunderstorm back toward the gate, he caught Abigail's gaze and saw both pride and fear mirrored in her eyes. For though the horse had been tamed by trust, Ethan knew the battle with her father was far from over. The dust had barely settled in the corral when the voices began to rise. What had started as murmurs swelled into a roar that no man could silence. Dozens of ranchers, townsfolk, wives and children cried out against Jacob Carter's deceit. They had seen the whip crack, seen the boy hold steady, and seen the black stallion, once the valley's terror, choose trust over fear. "That's enough," one man bellowed, pointing at Carter. "You can't call it fair and then cheat when the boy wins. He tamed him right before our eyes," a woman shouted, her voice fierce. "The horse stood calm as a lamb till you tried to spook him." Others took up the cry. "We all saw it. Don't rob him of this. Let the boy have what he earned." Ethan sat astride Thunderstorm, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. He had felt the shift, the instant, the stallion's head lowered under his hand. But this was something larger. The people themselves had found their voice. Sheriff Collins stepped forward, his boots sinking into the churned dirt. He raised his hand, calling for calm, though his gaze was fixed on Carter. "Folks, let's have order. This valley's always lived by one code, a man's word, and every soul here knows what was promised." The crowd fell into tense silence, eyes swinging from the sheriff to Jacob Carter. The rancher stood rigid on the porch, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. He had never been challenged so openly, never felt the ground shift beneath his boots this way. For years, his power had gone unquestioned, his word treated as law. Now, before the very people who had once feared him, his authority cracked. Abigail broke free from her chaperone's grip and stepped into the open, her dress whipping in the breeze. Her voice rang clear and defiant. "You all heard it. My father said if Ethan tamed Thunderstorm, he would give me to him, and Ethan has done what no one else could. He tamed the horse not with fear, but with love. He kept his part. Now it is my father's turn." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, swelling into chants. "Keep your word! Keep your word!" The sound pounded like drums across the ranch yard. Jacob Carter's hands curled into fists at his sides. He scanned the sea of faces, searching for allies, but even the men who once depended on his contracts avoided his gaze. He looked to Richard Morgan, standing stiff and pale at the edge of the crowd, but the younger man only shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer about wealth or alliances, it was about honor, and Carter was outnumbered. Ethan urged Thunderstorm a few steps closer, his voice carrying steady and clear. "You called me nothing but a poor hand, Mr. Carter. Maybe that's true, but today, your horse stands with me, not you. Your people's eyes are on me, not you. If being poor means I fight with honesty instead of deceit, then I'll wear it with pride. But you must decide what kind of man you are." Gasps rippled through the crowd at his boldness, but no one rebuked him. Instead, more voices lifted in support. "The boy speaks true. He earned it. No more lies, Carter." Sheriff Collins stepped to the base of the porch, his jaw set. "You heard them, Jacob. You gave your word. If you break it, then you've broken the one thing no rancher can live without: trust." For the first time, Jacob Carter looked cornered. His chest heaved, his face lined with fury and something deeper fear. He saw his empire crumbling not by Ethan's hands alone, but by the collective will of the people he had lorded over for years. Abigail lifted her chin, her voice softer but unwavering. "Father, this is your choice. Keep your word, or lose everything that makes it worth keeping." The crowd roared again, their chants deafening now. "Keep your word! Keep your word!" Carter's shoulders sagged under the weight of it. He tried to speak, but his voice caught. When he finally managed words, they came slow, forced, like stones dragged from the earth. "Fine," he ground out. "The boy has done it. He tamed the horse." He swallowed hard, his eyes dark. "And he may have my daughter." A cheer erupted, wild and jubilant, shaking the very boards of the ranch house. Hats flew into the air, Children clapped, women wept, and men pounded the rails in thunderous rhythm. Abigail rushed forward, her skirt flying as she reached Ethan. For the first time in front of the entire valley, she took his hand in hers, her face alight with joy and defiance. Ethan looked down at her, his own eyes burning with disbelief and gratitude. Thunderstorm shifted beneath him, calm now, as though he too understood the weight of victory. But amid the cheers and celebration, Jacob Carter's eyes burned like embers. He had spoken the words, but in his heart, defeat festered like rot. He would not forget this humiliation, and Ethan knew, even in triumph, that shadows still lingered at the edges of the prairie. The prairie had always been a place of dust and hardship for Ethan Miller, but on the morning of his wedding, it seemed transformed. Wildflowers colored the meadows, their petals lifted by the warm summer breeze, and the mountains in the distance stood like ancient guardians, silent witnesses to the day. Families from across the valley streamed toward the Carter Ranch, not for cattle auctions or rodeos, but for something far rarer, a wedding born from struggle, faith, and defiance. The yard bustled like a fairground. Women laid out pies and roasted meats on long wooden tables. Children ran laughing between wagon wheels, and ranch hands hung lanterns strung with ribbons. It was not the grandeur of a city ceremony, but it was a celebration stitched together by community. Every neighbor who had watched the trials, every voice that had cried out for Ethan's victory, now lent their hands to honor it. Ethan stood near the corral where everything had begun. His suit was borrowed, the jacket slightly too large at the shoulders, but his eyes were steady, and his hands trembled only with anticipation. Thunderstorm grazed quietly nearby. A wreath of wildflowers looped gently around his neck. The stallion, once the valley's terror, now stood as a living symbol of change. Tommy clapped Ethan on the back with a grin. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd be the talk of the whole valley, much less the groom." Ethan laughed softly, nerves fluttering in his chest. "Neither did I." Music drifted through the air, a fiddle and guitar striking up a slow, joyous tune. The crowd turned as Abigail stepped forward. She wore a simple white dress sewn by neighbors' hands, its lace edges delicate but strong. Her dark hair flowed loose down her back, a crown of prairie flowers resting atop her head. For Ethan, there was no grandeur more beautiful than the sight of her walking toward him, her eyes locked on his, her steps sure and proud. When she reached his side, the minister, an old preacher with a voice roughened by years of wind and dust, raised his hands. "We gather here not in wealth or power, but in love, the only bond stronger than storms, stronger than fear." His voice carried across the prairie, stirring the hearts of all who listened. Ethan and Abigail joined hands, and the preacher asked for vows. Ethan's voice, quiet but unshaking, carried a promise as deep as the land itself. "I swear to stand by you through hunger and harvest, through sorrow and joy. I will not bend when storms come, and I will not break when men try to pull us apart. You are my heart, Abigail, and I will never let it go." Tears shimmered in Abigail's eyes, but her smile held steady. "And I swear," she answered, her voice clear as birdsong, "to walk beside you no matter how rough the trail. I will share your burdens, your dreams, and your scars. You've tamed more than a horse, Ethan, you've tamed the fear in me. My heart is yours, now and always." The preacher's voice thundered like a hymn. "By the power of love greater than any law, I declare you husband and wife." Cheers exploded through the crowd as Ethan and Abigail sealed their vows with a kiss. Hats flew high, music quickened, and laughter rippled across the ranch yard. For a moment, the valley felt lighter, freer, as though the weight of Jacob Carter's pride had lifted entirely. Yet even amid celebration, shadows lingered at the edges. Jacob stood on the porch, his face unreadable. He had spoken his word and could not take it back, but his pride smoldered, wounded beyond repair. He raised no toast, offered no blessing, only turned his gaze toward the mountains, his silence as heavy as stone. Still, the day belonged not to him, but to Ethan and Abigail. As twilight fell, lanterns flickered to life, and the newlyweds danced in the dirt yard, the music of fiddles and guitars mingling with the laughter of their people. Thunderstorm stood nearby, head lowered, as if bowing in quiet approval. When Ethan finally led Abigail away from the crowd, they paused by the corral. The stallion approached, brushing his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder before nuzzling Abigail's hand. She laughed through her tears. "He accepts me too." Ethan stroked the horse's mane, whispering, "He always did. He was just waiting for me to prove it." And there, beneath the endless Montana sky, surrounded by their people, their horse, and the love that had defied every storm, Ethan and Abigail began their life together, not in riches, but in truth. The first year of marriage carried Ethan and Abigail into a rhythm neither had dared to dream. Their small cabin near the edge of the prairie became a place of warmth, not wealth, but of laughter and shared burdens. Abigail planted flowers along the windowsill, their colors bright against the rough boards. Ethan repaired the fences each dawn, his hands steady and sure, and each evening he returned to her smile. It was not ease that marked their life, but resilience, a quiet triumph stitched together from every scar and every vow. Thunderstorm lived in the pasture just beyond their cabin, his presence as steady as the mountains. Each morning, when Ethan stepped outside, the stallion lifted his head and snorted a greeting, his dark coat shimmering under the rising sunday. Children from nearby ranches came to watch, marveling at the once feared beast who now allowed them to stroke his mane. Ethan never forgot the weight of that trust. He carried it like a torch, lighting the path forward. It was Abigail's idea to turn their gift into something greater. "There are others like him," she said one evening, sitting beside Ethan as the fire crackled low. "Horses broken by cruelty, left scarred and unwanted. You gave Thunderstorm back his life. Why not give others the same chance?" The thought burned in Ethan's heart, growing brighter each day. Soon, with the help of Tommy and a few neighbors, they built a modest barn and fenced fields wide enough to hold more than one soul in need. They called it Haven Ranch, a sanctuary for horses others had given up on. Word spread quickly about the boy who had tamed the untamable with kindness, about the couple who believed trust could heal what whips had broken. Men arrived leading wild-eyed Mustangs, their ribs sharp from hunger. Women brought colts they could not manage, too skittish to touch. Some even brought horses scarred like Thunderstorm, eyes haunted by memories of pain. And time after time, Ethan knelt in the dirt, patient as the prairie wind, whispering songs and promises until the fear began to melt. Abigail worked beside him, her laughter filling the air, her hands gentle as she brushed tangled manes. Children came to watch, their eyes wide with wonder, learning that strength did not always roar, it sometimes whispered. The valley, once divided by wealth and pride, found itself united around the sanctuary. What had begun as one man's defiance became a flame that lit many hearts. Even Jacob Carter, though his pride resisted, could not remain untouched. He visited once, unannounced, riding out to the sanctuary at dusk. He watched from a distance as his daughter laughed beside Ethan, as Thunderstorm trotted calmly with a child perched on his back. The sight cut him in ways he had not expected. For years he had ruled by fear, believing respect could be bought with power, but here, before him, respect was earned by love. He left without speaking, but something in his eyes had shifted, like stone beginning to crack. One evening, as the sky blazed with orange and violet, Ethan stood at the fence of Haven Ranch, Thunderstorm beside him. He rested a hand on the stallion's neck, feeling the steady strength beneath. "We did it, didn't we?" he murmured. "Not just you and me, but all of us," Thunderstorm huffed, warm breath curling in the cool air, as if in agreement. Abigail joined him, slipping her hand into his. Together they watched the herd grazing in peace, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. The prairie wind swept around them, carrying with it the echoes of hardship, the memory of scars, and the promise of tomorrow. Ethan thought of his mother's words, "The scars we carry aren't just reminders of pain. They're proof we survived." He smiled faintly, feeling the truth of it settle deep in his bones. The boy who had once been mocked as nothing more than dirt under a rich man's boots now stood as a man who had given the valley something greater than spectacle. He had given it hope, and in the heart of Montana, where storms still rolled down from the mountains and winds howled across the endless fields, a flame burned steady. It was not a fire of rage or conquest, but of love, trust, and the quiet courage to keep going. It was a flame that did not die, and that was the story of how a poor young man, a wounded horse, and a forbidden love changed an entire valley forever. If this tale touched your heart, drop a simple comment, just type 0 or 1 below so we know you're here with us. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of humans and animals that will move you to tears and hope. The next story may be even more unforgettable. Will you be there to see it?